We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respect to their elders past and present. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Liz. How are you?
Morning. I'm good, thanks.
Excellent. So, I have some bad news. This week I've chosen a paper that isn't about quality spaces.
Okay.
So we'll give everyone a moment to mourn or turn us off. Instead of quality spaces, I thought we should look at this paper by White, Browning, Garcia, Pellegrin, Davies, Dubois and Clayton, which is a review paper on consciousness in corvids. So Liz,
Birds.
what are corvids? Yes, birds.
Crows?
Yep, crows, magpies, jays. A second question, Liz, to kick us off. Why are we so interested in this family of birds in particular?
So I always think of parrots as smart, but I think maybe the corvids are smarter.
Yeah, these birds are brilliant. Some of the best problem solvers and tool users on the planet. Because of that intelligence, there's already a wealth of studies on the minds of these animals, which White et al. Can draw on. But what's the problem with these birds?
Don't know.
Yeah,
Their brains are heaps different.
Brains are heaps different. That's the serious problem. I was just going to say they're not as cute as parrots.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
Yeah, who you might be able to hear chewing their seeds in the background. You can definitely hear them singing over us sometimes.
And you should tell Glenn to get me a galah. And he'll tell me to get rid of our mammals.
Yeah, I will. Because if we get a galah, I'd like to be able to cuddle it. So to give some structure to their review, White et al. Ask about 5 dimensions of consciousness. These are taken from an earlier proposal from a Birch et al. Paper. Now, these aren't dimensions in the sense that we've been talking about previously with regards to quality spaces. You can think of them more as different aspects of consciousness. I found it most natural to think of them as questions we should ask about consciousness in corvids. So these are, number 1, sensory experience. So what sensations do the birds have? 2, evaluative experience. This being, how do birds experience things as good or bad? 3 is experience of the self. So how do the birds experience themselves as a self, as an agent or subject, or as embodied? We'll get to some of the relevant aspects there. 4 is the synchronic unity of experience, so how unified is experience at a particular moment. And 5 is the diachronic unity of experience, so how unified is their experience across time. Any questions about what any of that means before
No,
we
I
get...
think they're all impressively interesting questions. No idea about whether they're exhaustive, but I don't also know whether that matters tons.
I think we don't need to assume they are exhaustive.
Cool.
We just need to assume that there's some interesting data towards these questions so far.
Yep, sounds good.
Alright, so that's how they structured their review. I thought what I would do in presenting their ideas, Liz, is just try and pick out one interesting example from each of these 5 sections. Alrighty, so White et al. Start with the question of sensory experience. So they're interested in particular in what they call the richness of experience, which is, quote, the degree of detail in which an animal consciously perceives the world around them, end quote. This could, of course, vary by modality, like how in humans who don't have sensory differences tend to have richer visual experiences than olfactory. They review some studies on vision, audition, and olfaction in these birds. I wanted to look at one of the vision tasks. I found this one to be particularly interesting because I think it's comparable to studies that are done with humans. So imagine this setup: a bird is shown 2 lights. One is flickering on and off at what is for them a slow rate, so say about 50 hertz. The other is on continuously. The bird's then given a reward, like a food reward, for picking the continuous light. By showing them other setups where the light is flickering at faster rates, we can tell what rate is needed for the bird to perceive the light as continuous. When would that be in the experiment, do you think?
No idea. I don't know off the top of my head what it is for humans.
Humans, yeah.
What is it for humans?
Something like 50 to 60 hertz, I think, for humans.
So that's 50 flashes a second?
That's right. We start to see things as continuous at about 24 frames a second, so that's why that's the lowest rate you can use for movies. But
that's where you need a movie nerd.
We can definitely see improvements higher than that. So, like, especially with HD images, a 24 frame a second film looks quite jerky. Alright, so behaviourally, we're talking here about when the bird is no better than chance at picking out the flickering light from the continuous. Now, I did go and look at the methods from one of the reviewed papers here, and they actually use a stronger criterion than just better than chance, which I quite like, because we know that humans can indicate the presence of a stimulus at better than chance levels, even when it's presented so briefly that they say they didn't see it. So the stronger criteria is perhaps more indicative of consciousness rather than just unconscious perception.
You can get it by chance but not be able to report it. It can do better than chance, but say you didn't see it. But, I mean, that's the good old awareness has fuzzy boundaries, I think is what I want to say.
Using just a better than chance measure puts us in that fuzzy boundary of where humans are conscious and not, or not.
But it's certainly, if you're interested in what do they represent, putting aside issues of awareness, then the 50% is going to get you that. So if you're interested in their discriminatory abilities, I guess.
Yes, that's right. But if you're interested in consciousness, you want a stronger measure, sort of more analogous to a report.
I think what I want to say is that saying I saw it is actually potentially quite a strong criterion. And there might be lots of things which are on the edges of awareness, but which I'm not comfortable saying I saw it.
Yeah.
And so I like setting the bar quite low to begin with.
Yeah, right. So there's a couple of different issues here. One is, do we want to investigate the fuzzy boundary? Which I think is what you're leaning towards there, Liz. The other is, do we want to just investigate cases where we're confident of consciousness? And I think that's what they wanted to do with the birds in these studies. So their criteria here is showing what they call a strong preference for the continuous light over the flickering one, where a strong preference is picking it at least 4 out of the 5 times. Perhaps, these choices are made because people tend to sort of be weirdly skeptical about consciousness in non-human animals. I think we like that because we want to be able to eat them. But using these sorts of strong criteria, I think, does put us clearly on one side or the other of the fuzzy boundary rather than within it.
I guess I don't know why 4 out of 5 versus 3 out of 5 matters.
But you'd be confident, like, if a human did that, picked the continuous one 4 out of 5 times, you'd be pretty confident in saying that they were seeing that one as continuous and the other one as not.
Well, they can tell the difference.
Yeah.
Is telling the difference sufficient for consciousness? I don't know. I mean, I'm inhabiting a skeptical position that I don't believe.
I think that sort of extreme skepticism is not helpful with these sorts of studies if you're just going to go, a bird gets held to a higher standard than a person to prove it's conscious.
I think what I'm getting stuck with is I think the term conscious is ambiguous.
I don't think there's an ambiguity here, though, because it's a behavioural report study, so it's clear that they're talking about measuring awareness.
Yeah. So they want to be certain that the bird was aware.
Maybe this wasn't the right one for me to pick of the examples, because this hasn't been done with corvids, but it has been done with other perching birds. And what we see with them is that they stopped showing a preference for the continuous light somewhere in the range of 130 to 140 hertz.
Whoa.
Some variation on the species there.
So for us, it's 24.
Yeah.
So like 5 times.
Yes.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, so 24 hertz, we start to see it as continuous, but it's more at the 50 to 60 hertz range that we would show no preference for the continuous light.
So double.
So there's much greater temporal resolution in their experiences here, as suggested by these. Now, like I said, White et al. Say that there haven't been studies on this with corvids, but we do know that Eurasian jays can use videos at 120 hertz to guide their behaviour. So we're probably...
What does that mean?
Yeah, I wasn't super clear on that, and that wasn't a study that I went and looked at more, which I probably should have done, because that's a good question.
Yeah, I would like to know more.
More on that, yeah, I should have looked that up. That's my bad. Anyway, from the flickering light studies, I think it's fair to say that perching birds experience vision as more detailed in time than humans, that visually they can distinguish faster changes in the environment than we can.
Mm-hmm. The temporal resolution is finer.
Next, we're going to turn to the second question, which is about evaluative richness. So here, White et al. Are talking about how the birds experience things as good or bad for themselves. The side term for this is valent. So here, things that are experienced as good for the self are called positively valenced, and things that are experienced as bad for the self are called negatively valenced. In humans here, we're talking about feelings of emotions or of pleasures and pains.
Yum, yuck.
Yep, that sort of stuff. The question is, what sort of evidence speaks to the richness of a corvid's valenced world?
How much do you have to change something to make it go from yum to yuck?
Yeah.
Or how strong are their preferences or something? And how icky does it have to be for them to stop eating it? Sorry, I'm thinking of all horrible experiments.
Yes. Let's not torture birds. Birds are our friends. I think, yeah, the sort of stuff that's been done is more like the second of those options. But before we get to the example, I found this section to be one of the trickier parts of the paper to get my head around, because White et al. See the existing work they review as being limited in various ways, usually in terms of the indirectness of the measures of the valenced experience. And again, here in this paper is where we face our nemesis of the under-description of experiments in review papers. I thought, because of the limitations that White et al. Identify, that the most interesting thing from this section is actually what they suggest for future work. And from that, we can at least get a good sense of what we don't know about this. So how does that sound if I go through that suggestion?
Sure, I don't know until you do it and I get confused.
Yeah. It's hard to, ask about good and bad feelings when we don't have linguistic report. The suggestion that White et al. Make is to start looking at the ability of birds to make motivational trade-offs. So to compare two or more choices and then select one.
That's the thing I was trying to say.
That's the sort of thing that you were trying to say. I thought so. So what sort of choices? The example they give is that, and this comes from an actual observational study, is that birds in the wild, these birds will have sort of strict dominance hierarchies, and they'll respect this when it comes to coming out of shelter to get food. the dominant bird will leave shelter first to try and get the food, and less dominant birds will tend to hide when the dominant bird is around so they don't get attacked. But there comes a point where the less dominant bird gets hungry enough that it will come out and risk being attacked. Now, there are wild observation work with ravens, hooded crows, and magpies that all suggest they could be making these evaluations where eventually less dominant birds come out and apparently risk being attacked to get to a food source.
And
But
is the idea that they'll risk getting attacked for better, yummier food? Or they'll play it safe and go for the ickier food so the boss bird won't get cranky?
yeah, so that's the sort of experiment that hasn't been done yet.
Okay.
All that there is that there's observational work that suggests eventually the birds get hungry enough that they will come out
Well,
and risk it. Yeah. Yeah. But I think what White and Owl are suggesting is more like what you're saying there, that it would be possible to do some experiments to see the different points at which birds make that trade-off.
But it would be tricky to know whether they're going for the less valuable food because it won't piss the boss bird off. Like, I'm going to get crankier if you eat my chocolate than if you eat my carrots. It would be interesting to see how you can design the experiment so you can distinguish between going for the less valued food or because you don't want to piss the boss bird off, or going for the higher value food because that's the only one that's worth the risk.
And so you'd need to have good setups that would depend on the bird's previous experience with aggressive birds, their knowledge of the presence of those particular aggressive birds, as you say, food of different values and so on, as well. So according to White et al., those sorts of experiments haven't been done yet, but I think we'd agree that they would say something about the kinds of evaluations that the birds are making.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Be interesting.
There are other behavioural observations that suggest that corvids have quite a rich valence world. Again, these don't have the sort of experimental controls that we're talking about there that allow us to rule out other explanations. But wild birds have been observed to show a variety of interesting behaviours towards the dead of their own species, which other kinds of birds don't. And these have been interpreted as potentially looking for danger behaviours, so trying to find if the dead bird was hurt by something, and if so, try and determine what it was.
So what's the point here? Do birds have positive and negative dimensions to their experience?
Yeah. Something that would be analogous to feelings of emotions.
I mean, of course they do.
It's not just, and White et al. Are quite clear about this at the start of the paper. They say there's sort of an empty debate to be had about just whether or not the animals have any experience of these types. And the more interesting thing is, what does the evidence say about the details of their experience? And I think that's what they're trying to get at here, is not just, do birds have something like emotions? I mean, that is a fairly trite sort of question.
I mean, you've got to, if you're talking about positive and negative valence, I'm thinking, where would I say they don't? Well, even worms would eat some things over other things.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Indeed. And so if you have this sort of broadly Jamesian, so think Damasio in the modern form, idea about what feeling of valence is, it's a very ancient part of the mind.
I mean, if it's just yuck yum, which I think is no reason to say it's not.
Yeah. So we should be asking, according to White et al. Here, is, the sort of more detailed question. So not just do birds, show this, some species of birds show these sorts of behaviours towards the dead of their own species that others don't. Sure, interesting as far as it goes, but a more interesting question is something like, do they show different responses towards the death of familiar birds as opposed to an unknown bird of the same species? So that's the sort of thing that we want to get to. But I think very clearly from those two examples, and certainly my reading of the rest of the examples they give there, we have more questions than answers about the details of these birds' evaluative experiences.
Mm-hmm. Having lived with birds, they frickin' love millet a lot more than they love other seeds. You could see preferences in what they will consume.
Yeah, so we're happy to say that birds have preferences like that. All sorts of birds would, as you say, Liz, you'd expect worms to have preferences like that. I think potentially interesting about corvids, given the sophisticated nature of their social structures, is what are their social emotions like? And that's the sort of thing that we might get to when those experiments relating dominance and food preference come to. We might get a clearer idea of how they feel about other birds. So the next section then is on the synchronic unity of experience. So that is some words. So, Liz, what's synchronic unity?
Synchronic means at the same time. So it's about whether you construct a unified picture of the world across, say, your senses.
Yeah.
So do you integrate your perception of the movement of the hand of the clock with the sound?
Yeah.
And does it seem weird when they come apart?
Mm-hmm.
Would be the test?
Yeah.
Sort of test? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing then, what do they look at? The temporal dynamics of that? If they can distinguish things at 120 hertz visually, what's the frequency they need via audition, say?
Interesting. I think that actually sounds a bit better than some of the stuff that they talk about. So the way you set it up was almost word for word how they set it up. So that me say the integration of experience at a moment of time, quote, into a single unified sphere or unique point of view, end quote.
Yes, so I was trying to pull apart what a unique point of view might mean.
The approach from White et al. Here is to ask what would be synchronic disunity. So how would we imagine that? So this is easier to imagine synchronic disunity from the outside than the inside.
Yes.
So from the outside, you're just looking at a complete functional dissociation, say visual information never interacting with auditory information. So they're going to suggest that split brain subjects have a synchronic disunity.
Do they?
In their experiences. Well, yeah, do you want to just run us through quickly what your memory of a split brain is?
Is that the conjurotomy where they stick the needle up your nose and cut your brain in half?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's done for medical people who have really bad epilepsy. So that's wonky activity spreading throughout the brain. They'll cut the connection between the brain so the wonky electrical activity can't spread and it reduces the severity of the seizures. And if you cut the brain in half, so usually language is localised to one side, so only one side of the brain can talk to you, so to speak. But you can get the other side of the brain to, say, report via gesture. And what they found was that so usually language is on the left hemisphere of your brain, which means it will tell you about information which is coming into the right eye. So if you show the right eye one thing, so right eye can tell you what it sees, left eye has to point. So if you show the left eye something, the right eye will say, I didn't see anything. But if you ask the person to point to what they saw, then they'll point to it.
Now, this is interesting in the case of birds because birds, as we know, have quite different kinds of brains to mammals. And what the neurophysiologists tell us is that birds don't have a brain structure that's analogous to the corpus callosum. Cool. So they don't have this set of connections between the hemispheres of the cortex.
Do they have two hemispheres?
They do, yeah.
But they're not connected. There's not a bunch of wires running between the two sections.
Yeah.
Halves.
And importantly, not between the two cortices, right? So they still have a lot of subcortical connections between the hemispheres, but they don't have this large-scale hemisphere-to-hemisphere connection of the cortex that you see in mammals.
So how inaccurate would it be to say that their brains are always split?
So this is the sort of thing that people are suggesting.
Right.
But there is large-scale hemisphere-to-hemisphere connection in those parts of the bird brain that are analogous to the subcortical regions in mammals.
So the split brain stuff's interesting because information can leak via lower levels in humans. So they're not entirely isolated. It's just what information can the remaining connections carry.
Look, I don't know much about bird physiology. I would say, given the journal that this paper is published in, this was published in Animal Cognition, so you would think that if they got the physiology wrong, they would have been slapped down by reviewers in this journal. So I'd say they probably are right. This is interesting because some people have used this physiology to suggest that corvids have a sort of partially unified consciousness at a particular time. And the unification here seems to be about this idea of is it to have a unique point of view. So they're suggesting that there's sort of like perhaps more than one subject. There's a lot to be said about what is it for there to be a particular subject.
Yeah.
But I think, again, like we sort of started this section saying, I think it's easier to get a grasp on disunified experience from the outside than it is from the inside. So it's easier to look for a functional dissociation than to imagine what it's like. There is some evidence of some functional dissociations, which is interesting. In particular, it seems that sort of one side of the bird can be engaged in a task and the other half of the bird in a different task. This, they suggest, comes from the difference in how birds use their different eyes. So they'll use one eye to look for food and another to look for danger. Well, at least there's some suggestive evidence for that.
That's so tricky. So I was thinking I can use one hand to rub my tummy and the other hand to pat my head, but that doesn't mean I'm having a disunified experience.
Right.
Or I can be eating food while looking in my peripheral vision for somebody coming, oh, I don't want Lacey to know that there's this yummy food because then I'll have to share it with her. So,
right.
I can be focusing on the food and also on my peripheral vision or whatever.
Yeah, good. So the level of specialization here is higher than that.
Okay.
So there's observational evidence that if a task requires that they use spatial cues, so location of things, that corvids will use their left eye for that. But when they need to use cues that involve particular object recognition rather than location, they use their right eye.
And if you cover up the eye that they want to use, do they then fail at the task?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because That seems to me to be more definitive.
It would be. The mere presence of a preference doesn't show that the processing can't.
Well, think
be
of
done.
handedness in humans. And that I would prefer to use my right hand doesn't mean that my experience is disunified.
But in humans, you've got the corpus callosum to get the information from one side to the other that you don't have.
All I'm saying is that a preference is strikes me as far from sufficient to say that there is a disunity.
Yeah. But it's meant to be understood in the context of their particular physiology. So they think it means something different. The behaviour means something different in a bird than it does in a human because of the different physiology.
Because the information can't be passed through the lower structures? How do we know? If their brain has a different structure, how do we...
Yeah, no, this is the right question.
Subcortical structures can't carry that information.
Yeah, this is the right question, and and I think that your point about giving the bird a pirate eye patch would be what you'd want to do to really see that. So, again, there's some suggestive observations here, which would be worth following up on with proper experiments. So a lot of this stuff that White et al. Are using, a lot of the stuff they're reviewing, the experiments weren't asking specifically questions about consciousness. White et al. Are saying, well, as it turns out, these experiments do suggest something about consciousness that will need to be followed up.
Cool. So this is a call for more research review.
Oh, definitely.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah.
Guess who wants to go and put a pirate eye patch on her parrot after this, but who will only succeed in walking away with a bloody hand?
Yeah.
Parrots have very sharp beaks.
Yes. And bodily autonomy.
Yes.
We were just talking about synchronic unity, so what about diachronic unity? So unity across time. Another way of putting this question is, do corvids experience the world as flowing smoothly moment to moment?
Oh, so do they have a sort of memory?
Yeah.
Right, so...
What's their memory like? Because
I was wondering, how is it distinct? Right, so if they remember... See, we're talking animal cognition, so I'm thinking of the classic stuff they did with various animals about caching and how great their memories are. There was birds.
Yeah.
Is that sufficient to say they have a diachronic unity, having a memory and being able to go back to where they hid the food?
Right. Good. So those are exactly the studies that are going to be talked about here. Those were done with jays, blue jays and scrub jays, I think, were the ones that they did that with. So
are these quite old then? Because I remember studying some stuff about this as an undergrad.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can reconstruct. And they could remember, so they could not only remember where the food was, but they could remember which food was where and when it was too late to go back because that sort of food had rotted. So like the worms are going to rot before the seeds, and so they'd only go back to the worms for a certain period of time, and then they'd go to the nuts.
The two kinds of jays, magpies, they've also done this sort of study with. Jays are the most interesting because they're the ones that engage in this food caching. And it's notable when they go to retrieve the food that they don't need to search for the food. They go straight for the location where the food is buried. These sorts of studies have been classically interpreted as showing that the jays remember what was buried, where, and when, in a manner that's analogous to human episodic memory. Now, some reason to challenge that interpretation comes from differences in brain physiology. Retrieving episodic memories in humans seems to depend on direct signaling from the cortex.
I think you better say what an episodic memory is.
Yeah.
So episodic memory is remembering the particular event, so sort of like reliving it. as opposed to remembering the fact that. Is that right?
That's right. And there's lots of individual differences in how much it involves imagery and so on. But, the contrast here is usually to, like, just straightforward semantic memory, so memory for facts.
Dogs are mammals.
Yeah.
Versus, do you remember that time when Fives did the lamb dance?
Yeah, exactly. Some people might not know the lamb dance.
Yeah, we better tell them. So when our crazy border collie was a young puppy, we got some Indian lamb chops, and I gave both of our dogs a bone. And Fives got really excited and ran out into the backyard and basically ran around, throwing the bone up in the air and catching it again and prancing. So, yeah.
So
very hilarious.
Very hilarious, and a nice clear example of an episodic memory that we both have. So retrieving this sort of memory in humans seems to depend on direct signaling from the cortex to the hippocampus. Now, birds, according to White et al., have analogous structures, so analogous they get the names cortex and hippocampus. And there is some evidence that the bird hippocampus is important for memory, specifically storing spatial information, but there isn't, and again, we're trusting the physiologists here, analogous signaling directly from the cortex to the hippocampus. So I wanted to bring this in, and then again, I'm assuming they're getting the physiology correct here.
I'm just thinking about that in light of the claim before that one hemisphere does spatial processing and the other does object recognition. How the hell can they remember spatial stuff if the spatial cortex can't speak to the spatial memory?
When they're saying there isn't the direct pathway, they really mean there isn't the direct pathway. There's still some connection from cortex to hippocampus. It just sort of at least this is how I understand what they're saying, is that the connections go through more other parts of the brain, and so it's less of a direct connection. But I think that's a worthwhile question, and I wanted to sort of talk about this because the further I got through this paper, the less convincing I found these appeals to physiology as evidence about consciousness per se. It's the conclusion they draw here. So, quote, they're talking about Corvid's experience of episodic-like memory may be phenomenologically limited in comparison to mammals, end quote. I mean, that might be the case, but so given the cognitive sophistication we see with regards to their memories, I don't see why we're not looking at it just being a case of there being a different physiological solution to this problem of, directed memory recall. So, assume they're right, that there isn't that direct cortex to hippocampus connection like we see in mammals. Doesn't establish that there isn't a connection, it's just a different sort. And so without ruling out some sort of connection, I don't see how you're getting to this really strong claim about consciousness, which is the lack of directed memory recall.
What do I want to say about all this? That there are connections is one piece of evidence, but it's not sufficient to tell you what information can flow along the connections. You need to do some fairly sophisticated and fairly horrible cutting connections between bits of the brain experiments to work out what information flows.
I was thinking something similar, that not that we'd have to do the lesioning studies, but, given the way that the connections are set up differently, you can do like the eye patch sort of study that you were talking about, Liz, and see if that, completely blocks them from getting certain kinds of information or impoverishes it in some way or makes it take longer or what have you. And that sort of cognitive study would be more informative than just looking at the physiology. Because I think we're both sort of saying that there could be different physiological solutions to the same cognitive problem. Yeah. All right, let's jump to self-consciousness, because that's the fun part. So, Liz, here's an easy question. What's self-consciousness?
It's being aware of yourself, for example, your body, as distinct from other things. That's my first stab in the dark.
Yep.
How'd I go?
Yeah, you did. And that's one of the two aspects of self-consciousness that White et al. Are going to talk about. So that's a sort of body-world distinction. What's my body as a particular thing in the world? The other aspect they talk about is the self-other distinction. So the difference between me and you, which is particularly a mind-mind distinction.
Me and you. How do you tell the difference between those two?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the question. Yep. And so with that latter part, they're particularly interested in what is sometimes called theory of mind.
Yeah.
So here's the second easy question for this section, Liz. What's theory of mind?
It's the idea that other entities can have mental states that are different both from yours and from how the world really is. So really what White et al. Are focused on here is the attribution of mental states in that sense. So mental states, but to others and to ourselves. So we're trying to understand what others are thinking, and we're trying to understand what we ourselves are thinking. This is the part that White et al. Spend most of their time on, less so on the body-world distinction. One example, which I just found painfully adorable, involves Eurasian jays. So male jays will bring their mates food, and when they have a choice of what food to bring, they choose food that they have previously seen their mate eat. No.
Yeah. So corvids can be as adorable as parrots after all. What's a bit more compelling in terms of understanding this attribution of mental states to self or other is the strategies that jays use to protect their buried food. Birds that have never stolen food from another bird will bury their food once and then leave it. Whereas birds that have previously taken another bird's food, so we're talking about not ones that have had their food stolen in the past, but who have previously been thieves, will rebury their food elsewhere. So they bury it once, and then they dig it up and move it.
I've stolen food, so now I'm going to pretend to bury my food in one place and then move it somewhere else.
The times they do this is quite specific. So they will only do this when they know another bird has watched them bury it the first time.
Huh.
So this particular pattern of behaviour suggests that the bird generalises from their own previous thievery to the behaviours of others, and that they keep track of what others know. I think why this is particularly interesting is because it's not like the bird is just learning from the negative experience of having its food stolen. Yeah. It's learning from what previously has been a rewarded behaviour for it.
Cool. Yep.
That it's gotten other food. But it's learned to put itself in the point of view of the bird that it stole from. Yeah.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah. So the jay's theory of mind here is potentially quite complex, but it is difficult, Liz, as you know, with theory of mind studies, to distinguish between explanations of the behaviour in terms of theory of mind and those that are in terms of complex behaviour tracking. But as White et al. Note, the second round of burying food here is done in response to the absence of another bird, not its presence. So takes it to somewhere where the other bird isn't to bury it. So it's not tracking behaviour as such. It's tracking something a bit more abstract in terms of the absence of the bird. What seems to be really compelling in these is that there are birds that are doing this in response to their own prior thievery, not their experience of being stolen from. So it seems that's pretty good evidence that they're generalising from their point of view to another's.
Yeah, no, it's quite compelling.
Yeah.
Will they do it a third time?
No.
So say there's 3 rooms. It'd be interesting to give them multiple options so that it's not just going somewhere else, but going somewhere else where no bird is.
Yeah. So
rather
rather than just going to another room, they've got 2 rooms to choose from, and one of those rooms has a bird in it and one of them doesn't. Yeah.
That would be harder to argue against.
That would be very hard to argue against theory of mind explanation of that. I don't know if that's been done. I didn't go and look up the original study.
And then it would be cool to do more stuff, like, do they track whether the other bird is a thief?
Yes.
So, 3 rooms, bird, thieving bird, non-thieving bird and stuff. You could, I guess my point is, that's already compelling evidence, and there's so many more things you could do to get more compelling evidence.
Compelling, yeah. Yeah. But I think that's pretty good evidence as it stands, that the bird generalises from its own point of view to another's.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think what I find particularly compelling about that I've stolen, so I'm going to make sure people can't steal from me, is it shows quite a rich understanding of their own behaviour. Like, so they need to be able to go for, like you were saying, from what I did to what other birds might do to me. And so they need to have a conception of both themselves and other birds as agents.
Okay. So we've had one study or a little bit of evidence for each of the 5 dimensions of consciousness, the 5 questions White et al. Asked about Corvid consciousness. So what have we learned? What do you think, Liz?
I actually am most impressed by the last thing.
Yeah, me too.
Because the rest is fairly ambiguous and based on... Oh, okay, so it's really cool. Okay, let me say, what do I think is cool about corvids based on that? Holy crap! The last thing, they can generalise from their experience to the behaviour of other birds. The flicker rate is heaps higher. That's cool, and that they seem to use one hemisphere for object recognition and another for precise spatial location is interesting. I'm a bit worried about the way in which some of the inferences from physiology to content are made, and I would like to see more data about what does and doesn't flow through the connections.
Yeah, I think what we can say, to be fair, is that those 2 that we find the most compelling are the ones where the facts about the bird's consciousness are tested the most directly.
Yeah.
And so they're obviously going to pick out the thing that, you and I are most interested in for the purposes of these discussions. And I think it's fair enough to say that with the other aspects, particularly around memory and synchronic unity, that
the memory stuff's cool, but I learnt that as an undergrad, so it's not
a bit familiar. Yeah. For those things that we have more questions than answers. Which is fine. That's where White et al. End up as the conclusion of their review, and I think that they're really trying to push for more research, especially in terms of the evaluative stuff, so the positive or negative valence, which is good. That's a great thing to push for. Hopefully they'll do some of the research themselves, and we'll see more in coming years. All right, with that, let's call it a day. Thank you all. Thank you, Liz.
Bye.